Celebrities basically live in the glitz and glamour of the limelight, so it isn't often that we see them when they aren't perfectly styled in the finest clothes and pristine makeup.
In the flickering light of a projectionist's booth, they were gods carved from marble and moonlight, but when the grease paint was scrubbed away and the studio lights dimmed, who were the strangers staring back from the mirror? Were these titans of the Golden Age truly the ethereal beings we worshipped, or were they merely the architects of an elaborate, lifelong deception? Join us as we explore the unresolved tension between the public icon and the private ghost. From the iconic to the legendary, we investigate the 14 stars who left their beauty in the dressing room and the secrets they kept in the shadows. Lon Chaney. Before the era of computer-generated imagery and digital face swapping, there was only the flesh, the bone, and the brutal imagination of Lon Chaney. Known to the world as the man of 1,000 faces, Chaney was the cornerstone upon which the Hollywood horror genre was built. He was the undisputed titan of the silent era, a performer who didn't merely wear a costume but surrendered his entire physical form to the dark whims of the silver screen. To the audiences of the 1920s, he was a shapeshifter, a phantom who could manifest as a hunchback, a vampire, or a mutilated phantom at will. The mystery of Chaney, however, lay in the moments when the cameras were still. He was a master of the invisible. It was a common occurrence at Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer for Chaney to walk past the studio guards dressed as a common laborer, a weary carpenter, or a nondescript clerk, only to be found minutes later in his dressing room, already transforming into a nightmare. He famously refused to have a stunt double, and even more curiously, he often refused to let his own co-stars see his natural face before a production began. He lived in the gaps between the characters, a man who found safety in being someone else. Inside his legendary tackle box of terrors, the sensory details were harrowing. The air in his dressing room was often thick with the cloying medicinal scent of spirit gum and the sharp tang of rubbing alcohol. To create the iconic look of the Phantom of the Opera, he used fishhooks attached to wires to pull his nostrils upward and back, creating a skeletal, snub-nosed effect that caused his nose to bleed frequently. He used jagged sets of false teeth that sliced into his gums and heavy, restrictive harnesses that distorted his spine. There was a chilling, restless energy in these sessions. Chaney would sit for hours in a watchful silence, staring into the glass, watching his own identity dissolve into layers of grease paint and scar tissue. The emotional payoff of Chaney's life is a profound sense of tragic irony. Here was a man who spent his entire career hiding behind grotesque masks because he was the child of deaf parents, raised in a world where communication was silent and physical expression was everything. He felt that his own face was too ordinary to tell the stories of the broken and the misunderstood. He died in 1930, just as the silent era faded, taking his secrets and his true face with him into the earth. He was the ultimate stranger in Hollywood, a man who became a legend by making sure no one ever truly knew who he was. Bette Davis. If Lon Chaney was the architect of the mask, Bette Davis was the woman who set the blueprint on fire. By 1962, the golden age of Hollywood was decaying, and the studio system that birthed the glamorous starlet was gasping its final breaths. Davis, a two-time Oscar winner and the formidable Queen of Warner Brothers, found herself at a crossroads. While her contemporaries desperately clung to soft focus lenses and heavy layers of smoothing foundation, Davis made a choice that would redefine the horror of aging. She didn't just accept a role in the psychological thriller Whatever Happened to Baby Jane. She weaponized her own face against the very concept of Hollywood beauty. The incident that solidified this entry as the most shocking in our gallery was Davis's total takeover of the makeup chair. She famously pushed the professional artists aside, grabbing the grease paint herself to create the look of Jane Hudson. She didn't want to look like an actress playing a madwoman. She wanted to look like a living, rotting doll. She applied layers of thick white clown foundation that settled into every fine line and wrinkle, intentionally highlighting the passage of time rather than hiding it. She smeared garish, mismatched lipstick and drew heavy, distorted circles around her eyes, creating a visage that was both terrifying and deeply pathetic. The atmosphere on that set was charged with a chilling, restless energy. Witnesses described the watchful presence of Davis as she sat before the mirror, obsessively piling on the powder until it began to cake and crack like parched earth. There was a tragic irony in the air. Here was one of the most powerful women in cinema history, a legend who had once commanded the screen with a single glance, now hunched over a vanity, making herself a grotesque. The scent of heavy, stale perfume and the sight of her matted blonde wig created a sensory overload that felt less like a movie set and more like a funeral for the ingenue. The emotional payoff for Davis was a bittersweet resurrection. By stripping away the protection of a flattering mask, she found a new kind of immortality. The film became a massive hit, proving that her talent was far more durable than her youth. However, the loneliness of that choice was profound. To the public, she had become the monster she portrayed. She spent her final decades as a woman who was respected for her courage but feared for her reality. She showed the world that the most haunting thing an icon can do is refuse to stay frozen in time. Jean Harlow. Imagine a world where the very air you breathe turns your blood into a slow-acting poison. For Jean Harlow, the 1930s were not just a decade of stardom. They were a countdown. Her fame was built on a foundation of impossible light. She was the Platinum Blonde, a title so iconic that MGM reportedly offered prizes to any fan who could match her hair color. But beneath the surface of the brassy, laughing girl who captivated a nation, a cellular disaster was unfolding. The glowing skin that looked so divine on camera was actually a symptom of a body in total systemic failure. The incident that transformed her into a stranger occurred in the summer of 1937. While filming Saratoga, the vibrant Harlow began to vanish. Without the heavy layers of studio grease paint and the tactical use of lavender-hued powder to counteract her sallow undertones, she was entirely unrecognizable to her colleagues. Her face, once sharply defined and youthful, became bloated and pale due to uremic poisoning. Her kidneys had simply stopped working. The tragic irony was that the more she suffered, the more makeup the studio applied to hide the reality of her dying. In her final days on set, she was a walking ghost, a girl hidden behind a mask of health that was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. When she finally collapsed and was taken home, the mask was discarded. In her private chambers, the woman who had defined Hollywood glamour sat in a watchful silence, her body failing her at the age of 26. The world would never see that version of Jean Harlow. They only saw the finished film, stitched together with body doubles and shadows, keeping the illusion of the porcelain doll alive long after the doll itself had shattered. Boris Karloff. The man born William Henry Pratt was a study in profound contrasts. To his friends and family, he was a quiet British gentleman with a deep love for cricket and a penchant for gardening. To the world of 1931, however, he was the face of primal terror. Boris Karloff did not simply act in the role of the monster in Frankenstein. He underwent a physical overhaul so invasive that it felt less like a costume and more like a sentence. While his peers were meticulously sculpting their cheekbones to attract the camera, Karloff was handing his face over to the genius of Jack Pierce to be dismantled and rebuilt into a square, deadened block of flesh. The incident of his daily transformation was a ritual of endurance that began long before the sun rose over the universal lot. For over 4 hours every morning, Karloff sat in a watchful silence as Pierce used spirit gum and cotton to build a brow that felt like a lead weight. The skin was turned a sickly shade of greenish gray, and the eyes were made to appear sunken and vacant. The most harrowing part of the process was the heavy asphalt boots that added several inches to his height and dozens of pounds to his frame. These boots were so restrictive that they permanently damaged Karloff's back, a physical price he paid for a mask he could never truly take off during the long hours of production. There was a tragic irony in seeing the real man during his rare breaks. Without the heavy brow and the bolts, Karloff was an unassuming slender man with a kindly face that seemed incapable of causing harm. Yet, the world refused to see William Henry Pratt. They only wanted the creature. Even in his later years, as the heavy makeup became too taxing for his aging body, he remained tethered to the shadow of the monster. He spent his career being recognized for a face that was not his own, a stranger to the very fans who claimed to know his every feature. Marlene Dietrich. Marlene Dietrich was a movie star with a meticulously engineered optical phenomenon. Born Marie Magdalene Dietrich in Berlin, she understood early on that the camera was a lyre that could be coached into telling a specific, breathtaking truth. Her transition from a cabaret singer with a round, youthful face to the razor-sharp icon of the silver screen was a triumph of geometry over biology. Working in a feverish, obsessive partnership with director Joseph von Sternberg, she mastered the art of butterfly lighting. This technique involved placing a single, harsh light directly above her head to cast deep shadows under her cheekbones and create a perfect, luminous triangle on her forehead. The incident of her lifelong transformation became a secret war against the mirror. As she aged, Dietrich refused to let the world see the softening of her famous jawline. She began to experiment with mechanical lifts, reportedly using surgical tape hidden beneath her wigs to physically pull her skin toward her scalp. This improvised facelift allowed her to maintain the illusion of a frozen, ageless beauty well into her later years. Without these hidden wires and the heavy theatrical contouring that she applied with the precision of a master painter, she was a woman whose face bore the honest marks of a long and complex life. She became a stranger to the very lens that had once worshipped her. Her final decade was spent in a self-imposed exile in her apartment on the Avenue Montaigne in Paris. She lived behind closed doors, refusing to be photographed or seen by anyone other than her closest circle. The tragic irony was that the most photographed woman in the world had become a ghost in her own home. She preferred to be remembered as a flickering silver image rather than a woman of flesh and blood who had succumbed to the natural law of gravity. Bela Lugosi. Bela Lugosi did not merely play Dracula, he was eventually consumed by the character. Born Bela Blasco in Hungary, he was a classically trained stage actor with a piercing gaze and a voice that carried the weight of old-world aristocracy. In 1931, he became the definitive face of the night, a creature of refined terror who needed little more than a high collar and a slicked-back widow's peak to captivate a generation. He was the ultimate aristocrat of the shadows, a man whose every movement was calculated to suggest a predatory ancient grace. However, the tragedy of Lugosi was that the mask of the vampire became a permanent fixture, a psychological shroud that he could never truly shed. The incident of his slow disappearance into the role became a heartbreaking reality during his later years. As the heavy, prestigious studio offers dried up and his health began to fail due to a long struggle with addiction, Lugosi found himself unrecognizable to the Hollywood that once worshipped him. Without the sharp, tailored capes and the precisely applied grease paint that gave his face its ghostly moonlit glow, he was a weary and frail man who looked far older than his years. The tragic irony was that he often walked the streets of Los Angeles in full costume, clinging to the only identity that still commanded respect. He had become a stranger to himself, a man whose real face was buried beneath the legacy of a monster. In his final collaborations with director Ed Wood, the mask began to crumble. The cameras of the 1950s were far less forgiving than the soft focus lenses of the 1930s. Without the strategic lighting and the heavy theatrical makeup of his youth, Lugosi appeared as a hollowed-out version of the Count, his skin paper-thin and his eyes filled with a desperate, lingering sadness. He was eventually buried in his Dracula cape, a final, permanent commitment to the mask that had both made and destroyed him. Greta Garbo. Greta Garbo was often described as the most beautiful woman in the history of cinema, a Swedish export with a face of such symmetrical perfection that it seemed to belong to a statue rather than a human being. During the 1920s and 30s, she was the divine, a star who commanded the screen with a minimalist intensity. Her makeup was a masterclass in subtlety. She favored a pale, matte base that made her skin look like alabaster, paired with deep, smoky eyeshadow that gave her a perpetually soulful, weary expression. This was the face that launched 1,000 ships and defined the high glamour of the Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer era. However, the incident that defined her legacy was her abrupt and total abdication from the throne of Hollywood. In 1941, at the age of 36, Garbo simply walked away. She spent the next 50 years as a phantom of Manhattan, engaging in a lifelong game of hide-and-seek with the public. To protect the legend of the Garbo face, She began to craft a new defensive mask consisting of oversized tortoise-shell sunglasses, wide-brimmed hats, and heavy trench coats. Without the meticulous application of studio kohl and the strategic lighting of the silent era, the real Greta Garbo became entirely unrecognizable to the fans who still clutched her old publicity stills. The tragic irony of her later life was that her attempt to remain invisible only made her more of a target. She lived in a perpetual state of watchful silence, walking the streets of New York at a blistering pace to outrun photographers. In the rare, grainy paparazzi photos captured in the 1970s and 80s, the world saw a woman with a weathered, deeply lined face that bore no resemblance to the ethereal goddess of Camille. She had traded the grease paint of the studio for the anonymity of the shadows, yet she found that the world refused to let her grow old in peace. She eventually became a prisoner of her own past perfection. By refusing to be seen, she ensured that the only version of her that truly existed in the public consciousness was a flickering black and white image from a bygone age. She gave the world her youth, and in return, she spent the rest of her life trying to reclaim a face that had long since become public property. Buster Keaton. In the Roaring '20s, while other comedians relied on exaggerated grins and rubbery contortions, Buster Keaton became an icon by doing absolutely nothing with his face. Known as the Great Stone Face, Keaton possessed a stoic, deadpan expression that remained unshakable, even as houses collapsed around him or locomotives soared off broken bridges. His screen makeup was a calculated minimalist mask. He used a pale, almost cadaverous white powder to flatten his features, accentuating his deep, soulful eyes, which were rimmed with dark kohl. This stark contrast made him look like a tragic Pierrot caught in a mechanical nightmare, a man whose silence was his greatest strength. The incident that transformed him into a stranger was the brutal transition to the sound era and his subsequent personal struggles. Without the pork pie hat and the smooth, pale pancake makeup of his youth, the real Buster Keaton was a man whose face was etched with the deep lines of experience and hardship. By the 1950s, when he began appearing in television cameos and commercials, the public often failed to recognize the weathered, rugged man as the same acrobatic boy wonder of the silent screen. The tragic irony was that the very stillness that made him a star now made him look like a relic of a forgotten empire. He had outlived his own mask, leaving behind a face that told the story of a man who had survived the gravity of both Hollywood and life. Hedy Lamarr. Hedy Lamarr was cursed by a facial symmetry so perfect it was often described as a lethal beauty. In the 1940s, she was the crown jewel of MGM, a woman whose smoky eyes and dark middle-parted hair launched 1,000 imitations. Her screen makeup was a delicate science of enhancement, using soft charcoal liners and a deep velvet red lipstick that made her appear more like a living painting than a creature of flesh and blood. However, the world's obsession with her porcelain mask created a profound paradox. While the public worshipped her exterior, they ignored the brilliant mathematical mind that was busy inventing frequency-hopping technology to defeat the Nazis. The incident of her transformation became a cautionary tale of Hollywood's cruelty toward time. As the years eroded the most beautiful woman in the world, Lamarr turned to the fledgling world of plastic surgery in a desperate bid to remain recognizable to a public that only valued her youth. These early, aggressive procedures left her features distorted and frozen, a cruel twist of fate for a woman who possessed a genius far more durable than her skin. Without the soft focus lenses of her heyday, the real Hedy Lamarr became a ghost haunting the corridors of her Florida home. She spent her final decades in a state of watchful silence, communicating with the outside world primarily via telephone, ensuring that no one could see the woman who had been eclipsed by her own reconstructed legend. Charles Laughton. Charles Laughton was a man who felt physically betrayed by the very industry he dominated. With a voice that resonated like a cathedral organ and a presence that could fill any stage, he was a titan of the British and American arts. Yet, in a town that worshipped the lean, sculpted lines of leading men like Cary Grant, Laughton saw his own reflection as a series of soft, doughy curves and heavy features. He famously remarked that he had a face like the behind of a baby, a self-deprecating mask that he wore to shield a deeply sensitive and artistic soul. This internal conflict reached its zenith in 1939, when he stepped into the role of Quasimodo for The Hunchback of Notre Dame. The incident of his metamorphosis was a grueling feat of endurance that left a permanent mark on his physical health. To create the distorted visage of the bell ringer, Laughton endured hours in the makeup chair as heavy, hot rubber prosthetics were glued to his face, pulling one eye downward and swelling his cheek into a bulbous mass. He insisted on wearing a heavy, weighted hump that actually strained his spine, choosing to live in the physical agony of the character rather than simulate it. Without these grotesque additions, the real Charles Laughton was a refined, scholarly man with a gentle spirit. Yet he felt most at home when he was completely unrecognizable. A bittersweet paradox defined his career. He used the most repulsive masks to reveal the most beautiful human emotions. While the public recoiled from his cinematic scars, they were simultaneously moved to tears by the vulnerability he projected through them. He proved that a great actor does not need a perfect face to capture the heart of an audience. They only need the courage to show the world the beauty that lies beneath the surface. Joan Crawford. Joan Crawford was the ultimate construction of the Hollywood studio machine, a woman who treated her own face like a high-stakes corporate rebrand. Born Lucille Lesueur, she possessed a raw, athletic beauty that she systematically refined into a sharp-edged mask of power. Her makeup was a geometric feat. She pioneered the overdrawn smear lip and the heavy rectangular eyebrows that gave her a perpetually aggressive and commanding presence. She was the architect of the power look, using every tool in the Max Factor arsenal to project a persona of unshakable strength and cinematic authority. The incident of her lifelong transformation was rooted in a profound fear of the natural. Crawford was notoriously obsessive about her appearance, reportedly splashing her face with ice water 25 times every morning and using lemon juice to bleach her skin. As she aged, the mask became more severe, a defensive wall of thick foundation and dramatic lashes that she used to hold back the tide of time. Without the meticulously applied war paint and the strategic lighting of the set, the real Joan Crawford was a woman whose face was a map of nervous exhaustion and intense insecurity. A heartbreaking contradiction defined her final years. The more she tried to fortify her image with layers of artifice, the more she became a prisoner of the very icon she had created. She spent her final days in a quiet, spotless apartment, refusing to be seen by the public that had once worshipped her architectural perfection. Orson Welles. While most actors use makeup to accentuate their features, Orson Welles used it as a structural fortification. The boy wonder who revolutionized cinema with Citizen Kane harbored a strange, lifelong insecurity. He loathed his own nose. He considered his natural profile too small and undramatic for the titanic figures he portrayed. Consequently, Welles became a master of the prosthetic, spending thousands of hours sculpted into a different man. From the bloated, corrupt police captain in Touch of Evil to the silver-tongued Harry Lime, he was almost never seen on screen without a latex addition. This calculated transformation was a quiet war against his own identity. He would obsessively tweak the bridge and the tip of his nose until it met his regal standards, often arriving on set hours before the crew to ensure the blend was invisible. Without these artificial enhancements, the real Orson Welles felt exposed and diminished, like a king stripped of his crown. Orson was a filmmaker who changed how the world saw movies, yet he could not bear the way the world saw him. He spent his final decades as a larger-than-life figure, a man who built a legendary career while hiding his true face behind a mask of his own making. Gloria Swanson. Gloria Swanson existed as a bridge between two incompatible eras of storytelling. In the zenith of the Silent Age, she was the supreme fashion empress of Paramount, a woman whose wardrobe choices dictated global trends and whose face was a masterclass in silent expressionism. Defined by high architectural brows and a gaze rimmed in heavy charcoal, she could broadcast 1,000 words without ever parting her lips. However, the most striking evolution of her career occurred in 1950 when she stepped into the role of Norma Desmond for Sunset Boulevard. It was an act of cinematic bravery that required her to inhabit a distorted, hyper-stylized version of her own history. The nature of this comeback was rooted in a deliberate visual dissonance. To portray a delusional recluse, Swanson utilized a makeup palette that was already 30 years out of date. She applied the thick theatrical grease paint and the exaggerated eyeliner of the 1920s, allowing the harsh, clinical light of the 1950s to expose every crack in the foundation. This specific aesthetic choice made her appear both formidable and incredibly brittle. Away from the cameras, the real Gloria Swanson was a petite, health-conscious woman who embraced modern living, yet she permitted the lens to capture her as a decaying monument to a dead empire. By embracing a look that was intentionally jarring and unrecognizable to those who remembered her as a young starlet, she achieved her greatest critical triumph. She demonstrated that while the industry had moved on to smaller stories, the performers who were fearless enough to confront their own shadows remained the true giants of the medium. Judy Garland. Finally, we arrive at the most human story of them all. Judy Garland was the beating heart of MGM, a girl with a voice that could crack a mountain, and eyes that seemed to contain all the hope of the world. But here is the thing about being America's sweetheart. It was a job that required a relentless, synthetic kind of perfection. From the time she was a teenager, the studio treated her face like a project. They used caps to fix her teeth and painful rubber discs to reshape her nose. They starved her, drugged her to keep her thin, and painted on a mask of youthful innocence that didn't leave much room for the girl underneath to breathe. The real transformation happened when the cameras stopped. Away from the arc lights, the glowing Dorothy Gale vanished. Without the heavy lashes and the expertly applied rouge, the real Judy Garland was a woman whose face told every story the studio tried to bury. She was often hollow-eyed, trembling, and exhausted, a stranger to the very image that made her a billionaire's asset. It is a striking irony that the world loved the voice but rarely looked at the exhaustion behind it. When she stepped onto a concert stage in her later years, stripped of the MGM look, she was raw and beautifully broken. She wasn't the girl under the rainbow anymore. She was the woman who had survived the storm. We've peeled back the grease paint, the surgical tape, and the studio lighting to find the people who lived in the shadows of their own legends. It makes you wonder, is a legacy worth the loneliness of a mask that never comes off? What do you think? Let us know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this deep dive, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe. Don't forget to ring the bell icon so you never miss a moment of the history that Hollywood tried to hide. Thanks for watching.